Gallivanting Across British Cultural Studies. This is a 6-part series which I'm producing as part of coursework for an independent study on British cultural studies and Stuart Hall. In each of these episodes, I will look at a series of texts, either the traditional literature from academic journals or books, or I guess more contemporary notions of that, listening to podcasts, viewing videos, and I will provide a summary of the important readings before turning some of the analysis from them towards something contemporary. Before I dive headfirst into British cultural studies itself, I'm looking at a series of Frankfurt School writings because they very much provide a foundation for a great majority of basically all scholarship which comes after, and British cultural studies is no different. Stuart Hall is very much informed by the writings of Adorno, Horkheimer, and their contemporaries, so it's important to at least cover the basics of some of their ideology before moving forward. To start off, I will be covering 2 works on this particular episode, the first of which is Adorno and Horkheimer's The Dialectic of Enlightenment. I'll be covering specifically their first chapter in that, which they outline what the Enlightenment was and why it was kind of inherently flawed. And then we'll also be covering Walter Benjamin, I think it's actually Benjamin because he's German. I'll also be covering his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So the Dialectic of Enlightenment was published in 1947 and is widely regarded as the foundational Frankfurt School text. Horkheimer and Adorno both sort of outline their particular critiques of liberalism, Enlightenment theories, and capitalism as a result of that in the aftermath of World War II. Despite never reading this before, a lot of the ideas present I'm very familiar with as they've been reiterated upon time and time again, and I think the core here is still very relevant and important. So let's dig into it. So the 2 begin by defining enlightenment in the widest sense as the advance of thought. This isn't just the highly specific liberal enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. This is the continued striving for knowledge and those ideals. Although enlightenment has always tried to liberate people from fear, the result now, after World War II, is a triumphant calamity. The Enlightenment's original intention was to replace superstition and fantasy with logic and reason. Born out of individuals like Francis Bacon, who propounded the scientific method and wanted people to rely on cold, hard facts and knowledge rather than not quite tangible traditions. And though knowledge knows no limits, knows no boundaries, the sky is the limit for knowledge. This is a double-edged sword because knowledge limitlessly enslaves the natural world and submits to worldly masters or people in power. As long as we have a strictly rational view of the world, we will always submit to a ruling class in some form or another. Very basic Marxist stuff. In the transition away from spiritual beliefs and naturalism, humans have discarded meaning. Yet this will eventually always turn on enlightenment itself, because any universal concept like meritocracies or human rights will be treated with the same suspicion that enlightenment once used on pagan myths. What's more is any attempt to resist this only makes enlightenment stronger. If a fable or a myth is wielded against enlightenment, then eventually the myth is just overpowered by corrosive rationality. This leads Horkheimer and Adorno to the bold claim that enlightenment is totalitarian. In this totalitarianism, it replaces more creative schools of thought with formal logic. And all of this logic is based on money, which makes dissimilar things falsely equivalent by giving them a price or a value. The 2 write, bourgeois society is ruled by equivalence. The 2 then contrast the notions of magic, which was an early way that humans related to their world, to religion. Magic worked with identification, whereas religion works through representation. Whereas Jesus being slaughtered is a representation of the individual atoning for their sins. This process of representation eventually becomes a universal fungibility, the religious sacrifice paving the way for the Enlightenment concept of equivalence. This equivalence produces a homogenizing effect, where whatever might be different is made the same. Although Enlightenment increases equality and brings an end to hierarchy, under this utopian ideal, there exists a mob rule that cannot tolerate any sort of difference. After a digression on the Hitler Youth and animism, we turn to German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who exemplifies the paradoxical nature of the dialectic of enlightenment. Kant thought that he was always making infinite progress, knowing more and more, but at the same time he thought that he was always limited because he could not apprehend what he called the thing in itself. So thought progressed and simultaneously regressed, just like enlightenment. As a result of this, positivism, or the end product of enlightenment, deals only with material things. Anything ideal or conceptual or pleasureful is banned from this positivism. That same positivism ultimately turns against thought itself, though, because thought is something that's immaterial, fanciful, and meaningless. Under enlightenment, the end product of human development is the total society of today, where everything is government. But people are turned into faceless, frightened masses that the Enlightenment was meant to rescue. Ultimately, Enlightenment gives humans mastery over nature, but human subjugation to nature returns in a new, subtler form. What follows in the book is a lengthy exploration of Odysseus and how he relates to this dialectic of enlightenment. Overall, a lot of what Horkheimer and Adorno are saying here seems to have direct echoes in other authors who I'm a little more familiar with, like Jameson or Baudrillard. I certainly agree with a lot of their prescriptions. I guess I'd like to read the rest of the book in order to get a better understanding of some of the harsher things here, because ultimately I do think the liberal ideals are still good things. I think equality and liberty and freedom are all good things, and we should work on maximizing them. I do understand their issue with logic, and as something which will always sort of lead to fascism, more or less. And I appreciate their critique of Kant as sort of emblematic of the Enlightenment era scholars. I do think the contents of this chapter are a little broad to apply to anything specifically, though I'm sure if I found examples in the Odysseus section that they would apply to modern things. Moving on to Benjamin's work, this essay very much focuses on the stunning democracy allowed by new forms of mechanical reproduction and technological advancement, specifically in the early 1900s with the popularization of photography and film. For the sake of ease of delivery, I'll refer to the author as Benjamin because I'm an ignorant American. His goal with this piece is to sort of delineate the differences between fascist appropriation of contemporary art forms like film and communist appropriation, seeing as this was sort of a big ideological battle being waged across Europe in post-World War I Europe in the 1920s. But since nothing's ever easy, we take quite a roundabout journey to arrive at that conclusion. Benjamin's essay starts by going back to Marx and recognizing that the endpoint of Marx's analysis was always that capitalist production is a self-fulfilling prophecy of its own making. And although at the time of writing and today this had yet to directly manifest, artistic production has always had the capacity to produce countercultural ideology and promote those ideas. And this is something which would only be accented by technological advancement. Benjamin begins by talking about how art has always been reproductive in nature. Not only was art concerned with mimicking reality or certain conceptions of reality to certain extents, but notable works such as paintings or books had been directly copied or reproduced ad nauseum so that others could experience them apart from the original. Technological advancements made this easier over time, and the first big step in this was lithography, or basically the ability to print ink on paper, the printing press. That process made it infinitely easier for people to get their hands on books or copies of books. And Benjamin argues that the next big step forward for this would be film, and readily accessible media of the modern age. Of course, him writing this in the 20s. Yet one thing that contemporary modes of media lack are the physical marks of wear and tear from the object existing temporally, whether it's changes in humidity or air temperature or water damage or any combination of those. Any old painting is going to be weathered by time, and it's going to show that on itself. This contributes to a notion of authenticity, which we all subconsciously recognize when we see an old book or an old painting or anything along those lines. This is something which a digital artifact like film just can't reproduce necessarily. In addition to this loss of a marker of authenticity, the prerequisite for an original and assured authenticity no longer exists. With modern modes of mass production, the original copy of something like a film matters infinitely less because it can simply be copied and replicated ad nauseum for relatively minimal cost. So the original copy of the film no longer has that inherent authenticity. The reproduction process nowadays is more independent than the traditional forms of reproduction. It also means that audiences experiencing it are much more likely to encounter a reproduction than the original. The historical testimony of the original object is affected, and the authority of it is jeopardized. We can think of this authority of the art as the aura, something that Benjamin will return to several times. Benjamin generalizes this term by saying the technique of reproduction has detached the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. He brings up contemporary historical films as an example, where the anachronism of the film's historical context and actual setting is at odds with the mechanical techniques used to produce the film itself. He then transitions to the concept that humans' perception of time changes based on their historical circumstances and material conditions, giving the example of the 5th century, which contained great shifts in population, the birth of late Roman art, and the Vienna Genesis. We then return to the notion of the aura, now defining it as almost the natural aesthetic perception of any given thing. Thus, the death of an aura is directly related to this new form of reproduction, and a modern desire to bring things closer spatially and humanly. Think of the mass urbanization which was happening at the time of this writing. It's this impulse which is at odds with art's uniqueness, which Benjamin describes as inseparable from being embedded in the fabric of tradition itself. This harkens back to earlier notions of artistic theory, in that early art exists in service of a ritual, and those that analyze the art do so as members of a cult. This isn't the modern negative religious connotations we sort of use it as, but instead it refers to the cult of beauty notion of artistic critique from the Renaissance period. It also has a double meaning in that those who evaluate art do so from a place of highly specific knowledge and training. A modern analysis of art must take this into consideration with the advent of the revolutionary art forms of the photograph and the widespread revolutionary thought offered by socialism. Benjamin sees these two forces as, for the first time in history, allowing mechanical reproduction to emancipate the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual and the cult of beauty. Instead, contemporary art can focus on the political. He divides the reception and valuation of art along two planes: those with cult value, or highly specific knowledge, usually academics or critics, and those with exhibition value, which is essentially just the public reception. Given the mass proliferation of art, we've encountered a role reversal of these two services, where suddenly the exhibition value is more important, and the outward impact of art is fundamentally different. Benjamin jumps from this duality to another, and covers the now archaic dispute of the artistic value between paintings and photography. Scholars from this debate who argued on the side of paintings would say that they are built out of true artistic autonomy, and that photographs are merely capturing something which already exists. Benjamin argues that since a photograph is such a straightforward reproduction, it calls into question and highlights the true nature of paintings and art as a whole, all of which function to reproduce or simulate certain aspects of reality, and thus are void of autonomy. We move to yet another comparison, this time judging the differences between a film actor and a stage actor. A stage actor works with the immediate physicality around him and plays off of an audience's expectations in crafting his performance. This is not something which a screen actor can do, as they are captured through a lens and subject to the specific composition of the editor. They do not engage with any tangible physicality, and they don't play off of audience's expectations in real time. So any audience identification with the screen actor is really one with the camera. This is an approach which isn't particularly conducive to cult values. When the film actor performs, he doesn't embody the identity of a fictional character, but rather his own identity. Since the actor's aura is tied to physical presence, in the absence of a live audience, his character's aura vanishes. The actor and the story's authenticity are replaced with the calculating vision of the director, enabled almost exclusively through technical means accomplished after the instance of the performance itself. If during recording the actor flubs a line and afterwards the director decides to change it, and change it however he likes. This instance of editing is not at all connected to the actual performance. It's something which happened after the fact. For Benjamin, this is a firm example for why art has left the realm of beautiful semblance. Another anomaly unique to the film actor is a feeling of strangeness they're overcome with when performing. This is the same estrangement felt when looking in a mirror, yet now instead of a mirror, the reflected image is separable, transportable. The film industry responds to this estrangement and shriveling of aura with the artificial buildup of a fictionalized personality outside of the studio, which represents the actor but isn't necessarily true to his physical presence. Looking more broadly, film has an everyman quality to it, as the barrier of entry for creators and performers is far less than writers before them. The distinction between reader and writer ceases to exist, and literary license is now based on polytechnic rather than specialized training. After embellishing this point with what feels like a pointless digression into datism, Benjamin returns to this proto-Baudrillardian notion that the creators can never mistake the film for reality. In the actual process of production, the setting is littered with cameras, various film crew attendees, and sets which only mimic reality from a certain angle. Another key difference between plays and films. To summarize, he says, the equipment-free aspect of reality here has become the height of artifice. The sight of immediate reality has become an orchid in the land of technology. Basically, because of this, film mimics reality far closer than a painting ever could, because everyone involved in its creation is always aware that it's merely mimicking reality, and it's born out of a uniquely mechanical focus. Once again shifting gears, Benjamin returns to an art piece's critical reception. The more a piece lacks social significance, the sharper distinction between formal criticism and public enjoyment. Yet with film, the critical and receptive attitudes often coincide. This is due to the fact that individual reactions are predetermined by the mass audience response, in that films are usually experienced simultaneously by a collective audience in the realm of theater. Films also present a greater opportunity to represent a man's environment and allows viewers a deeper perception. This is due to mechanical mastery of new equipment and also because of Freudian psychoanalysis. To avoid paraphrasing Introduction to Psychoanalysis, audiences essentially have the ability to analyze film better than they would another form of art. What follows is a lengthy justification for this reasoning, which more or less just outlines the concept of mise en scène before it became officially codified. We zoom out once more, and Benjamin posits that quantity has been transformed into quality, and contemporary academics worry too much about the mass appeal of film. Instead, we should question whether or not audiences have the ability to engage in critical analysis or engagement of film. On this, he says, reception in a state of distraction, which is increasingly noticeable in all fields of art and is symptomatic of profound changes in a perception, finds in the film its true means of exercise. The film, with its shock effect, meets this mode of reception halfway. The film makes the cult value recede into the background not only by putting the public in the position of the critic, but also by the fact that at the movies this position requires no attention. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. Finally, the piece concludes by saying that the reduction of art to aesthetics ultimately results in fascism, and that communism responds by producing art which is inherently political. A fascist would merely allow the masses to participate and create art which aesthetically reproduces prevailing societal trends. A rebuttal of this position from the left would allow the masses to create art which actively pushes for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Thus, through the mass production and consumption of the modern age, this ideology could be more broadly spread and eventually even achieved. Overall, I personally enjoyed Benjamin's piece, and I do think it's fairly relevant in a modern context. That being said, its conclusion and, honestly, theses feel a bit disjointed when considering the rest of the piece. He spends so long on what feel like pointless digressions into the differences between two very specific things, which I don't feel quite apply to the broader whole. And after rereading this several times, I still don't see any explicit connection between the cult understanding of artistic reception and fascism, which he seems to be implying but never explicitly stated. Nonetheless, I do think this is particularly important if we consider the internet and the sort of mass consumption and proliferation of art and the mechanical reproduction of art which it allows. We can think of several aspects highlighted in Benjamin's essay which are truer now than they were in the 1920s. This cult of aesthetic beauty form of artistic reception is almost totally divorced from reality at this point. Art is produced and consumed by the masses at once, and given the internet, we're allowed to share our thoughts and opinions and gravitate towards singular opinions much quicker. His point about film having an everyman quality to it and about the loss of literary license continuing to exist is very relevant today. Essentially, anybody can make or consume whatever they want via the internet. We don't even have the all-powerful media gatekeepers like we used to, with mass news and whatnot, losing a significant amount of power to decentralized forms of information via social media. Lastly, the point about inauthenticity and auras and manufacturing a personality alongside a piece of art is omnipresent. And at least from a Western perspective, our tendency to focus on individual narratives and constructed personalities and the mediatization of those more than anything else are very much indicative of this prediction. Thanks for listening. Next time, I'll turn my attention specifically towards British cultural studies and also start looking into some media studies scholarship on myths today and mass communication.